Gray despairingly tossed the pregnancy test onto the white tile of the bathroom. Two clear blue lines seemed to mock her profound sorrow. The Christmas miracle she had earnestly dreamed of had once again not come to pass. For 5 years, Gray and her husband Arthur had been trying to conceive. Expensive tests, IVF, countless medications, and even visits to shamans, nothing yielded results. Desperation and despair slowly poisoned their relationship, turning what was once a happy union into something dim and gray. On this Christmas morning, Gray felt particularly lonely. Arthur had gone to his parents, leaving her alone in their cozy but cold apartment, devoid of the laughter of children. Suddenly, a knock on the door shattered the silence. Standing at the threshold was Maxim, their brash neighbor known for his casual affairs and loud parties. "Gray? Are you alone?" he exclaimed, holding 2 baskets in his hands from which faint cries of babies could be heard. "Maxim? What are you doing here?" Gray murmured in disbelief, not trusting her eyes. "Christmas presents," he exclaimed with a mischievous smile, barging into the apartment. "You get 2." He carefully placed the baskets on the floor, and Gray peered inside with horror and curiosity. In both lay small, helpless infants dressed in festive onesies. "What is this?" Gray whispered, feeling her breath becoming heavy. "Babies, Gray," Maxim cheerfully exclaimed. "I found them on the church steps. Some unfortunate soul must have abandoned them. You've always dreamed of a child, so I decided to give you 2 at once." Gray stared at Maxim in disbelief, unable to comprehend this incredible reality. You're insane," she finally exclaimed. "What am I going to do with them? How do I explain that I'm not their real mother?" "Don't worry, Gray." Maxim waved his hand nonchalantly. "Just love them and they'll become yours. And I'll help. You know, I always dreamed of a big family." Gray didn't know what to think. Her heart was torn between a sincere desire to have a child and fear of the unknown. I can't just like that," she muttered. "Of course you can." Maxim approached her and took her hand. "It's your Christmas miracle. Believe me, you'll be the best mother in the world." Gray glanced at the 2 helpless beings who peacefully slept in the baskets. Her heart tightened with both unknown and inexplicable tenderness. "Okay," she whispered softly. "I'll try." The first days with the babies turned out to be chaotic and exhausting. Gray, who had never had experience caring for children, felt helpless and bewildered. Feeding, bathing, changing diapers, all of this proved to be incredibly challenging. Fortunately, Maxim turned out to be an extraordinary helper. He came every day after work, helping Gray with bathing, preparing formula, and even singing lullabies to them with his not-so-melodious but strangely soothing voice. Despite the difficulties, Gray felt something warm and bright blossoming inside her. She watched with immense love as the babies grew and developed. She gave them names Sophie and Mark. With each passing day, she became more attached to them, and now it was hard for her to imagine her life without their toothless smiles and tinkling laughter. One evening, as Gray was feeding Sophie, the doorbell rang. Startled, she almost spilled the formula. Her heart pounded in her chest. It was Arthur. He had returned earlier from his trip to his parents and was quite shocked to see 2 babies in their home. "Gray, what is this?" he asked, his voice trembling with shock. These are children," Gray muttered, feeling like a child caught in a forbidden game. Arthur stepped closer and looked at Sophie, who eagerly sucked on the bottle of formula. His face reflected a mix of astonishment and incomprehensible curiosity. "Where are they from?" he asked quietly. Gray told him everything about Maxim finding them on the church steps, about her own hesitations, and about how she and Maxim were taking care of the children. During her explanation, Arthur remained silent, his face impassive. When she finished, he firmly said, "Gray, do you realize this is madness? These children are not ours. We can't keep them. But I'm taking care of them, Arthur. They also deserve love and care." Gray protested, tears welling up in her eyes. "This is not the way to solve problems, Gray. We need to find their parents or take them to a shelter," Arthur stated firmly. Gray looked at Sophie, who now peacefully slept in her arms, and at Mark, who played with toys on the carpet. Her heart constricted. She couldn't imagine parting with these little creatures she had already grown to love with all her heart. "No, Arthur, I can't do this," she replied quietly but firmly. A tense silence hung between them. Arthur looked at her with a long, disappointed gaze. "Gray, this is not the conversation I wanted to have after coming home," he finally said. "We need to think and talk about this calmly." He turned and walked to his study, closing the door behind him. Gray was left alone with the children and her thoughts. She understood that the situation was complex, but the thought of parting with the babies was unbearable to her. The next few days were filled with tension. Arthur avoided communication with Gray, and he didn't interact with the children at all. Gray tried to maintain the usual routine, but thoughts of the future troubled her. One evening, as Gray was putting Mark to sleep, she heard a quiet knock on the door. She approached it with surprise and opened it. Standing at the threshold was her neighbor, Mrs. Olga, a pleasant elderly woman known for her delicious pastries and tenderness towards children. "Good evening, Graychick," she greeted softly. "I was passing by and heard a baby crying. Is everything okay?" Gray invited Mrs. Olga into the living room and told her about the situation with the children. "Such lovely children," she said softly. "And you're doing great, Graychick, taking them under your care. Not everyone would do the same." Her words were like balm to Gray's soul. She felt that her decision was the right one. But what about Arthur? She began, and suddenly an idea came to her mind. "What about your husband, Arthur?" Mrs. Olga asked. Gray told her about Arthur's reaction and her fears. Mrs. Olga paused for a moment. "Have you perhaps not shared the story of how these children came into your care with him?" she asked. Gray shrugged in surprise. "No, why would I?" Mrs. Olga smiled. "Maybe you should? Sometimes men need a little more time to adjust to new circumstances," she advised. "And it wouldn't hurt to talk to Maxim as well. Perhaps he can help you figure out this situation with the children's parents." Gray thanked Mrs. Olga for her advice and warm welcome. She felt her hopes revive slightly. Maybe Mrs. Olga was right. Maybe she should talk to Arthur and Maxim more openly. The next day, Gray decided to take action. She prepared a delicious dinner, waiting for Arthur to return from work. When he finally came home, she invited him to sit at the table and started the conversation. "Arthur, I want to talk to you," she said, looking him straight in the eyes. He nodded silently, taking a bite of chicken. Gray told him the whole story about Maxim's find, her doubts and worries. She also confessed that she had been dreaming of a child for many years. During her narration, Arthur listened attentively without interrupting. When she finished, he pondered for a while. "I understand this is a difficult situation, Gray," he finally said. "And I see how much these children mean to you." He paused as if weighing his words. "But we still need to find their parents. These are their children, Gray, and they have the right to know where they are." Gray nodded, understanding his words. "Of course, Arthur," she said. "I want that too. But for now we don't know who their parents are and they need our care." Arthur looked at her, and for the first time there was a hint of understanding in his gaze. "All right," he said. "But we must do everything possible to find their parents. And we need to talk to Maxim." Gray was surprised. "Maxim? Why?" Arthur explained his thought. "He found them. Maybe he has some leads that will help us find their parents. And besides, he promised to help you," he said. Gray agreed with him. She decided that she would definitely talk to Maxim the next day. The next morning, as Gray was preparing breakfast, the doorbell rang. Opening it, she saw Maxim standing on the doorstep. "Good morning, Gray," he greeted cheerfully. "How are my godchildren?" Gray led him into the apartment and told him about the conversation with Arthur. Maxim listened attentively, then said seriously, "I understand your concerns and I will help you find the parents of these children. But allow me to continue helping you care for them until we find their relatives." Gray looked at him, moved by his sincerity. She felt that Maxim truly cared for the children and wanted to help her in this difficult situation. And so began a new, uncertain stage in Gray's life. Her home was filled with the noise of children, and she cared for the two little creatures, not knowing whether their parents would be found and whether she could become their real mother. Ahead of her lay difficult decisions, searches, and perhaps disappointments. But Gray was determined to protect Sophia and Mark and give them the love they deserved. Whether their biological parents would be found or not, Gray already felt that the bond she had formed with them was special and strong. As they say, time will tell. Days turned into weeks, and the search for Sophia and Mark's parents yielded no results. Gray and Maxim carefully searched the area around the church where they were found, put up flyers with photos of the children around the town, and even reached out to the police. But there were no leads. Meanwhile, Gray was fully immersed in motherhood. She learned to distinguish each baby's cry, found the optimal feeding and sleep schedule, and even began to enjoy changing diapers, which had previously seemed like a chore. Every evening, when the children fell asleep, Gray and Arthur sat down at the table and discussed the situation. Their relationship gradually warmed as their joint care for the children forced them to cooperate more closely. Arthur, though he didn't rush to openly show his feelings for the children, gradually began to participate in their care. He bathed them, sang them lullabies, and sometimes even played with them with rattles. Gray could see that his attitude towards the children was changing. Sometimes she caught his gaze, full of tenderness and indescribable longing, as he looked at Sophia and Mark. One morning, as Gray was preparing breakfast, Mrs. Olga paid her a visit. She brought a basket of homemade pastries and, as always, inquired about the children. "How are things, Gray chick?" she asked gently. "Any news?" Gray sadly shook her head. "Not yet, Mrs. Olga," she replied. "I'm so afraid we won't find their parents. What if they really don't want to be found?" Mrs. Olga placed her hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry so much, Gray," she said. "Maybe they just need time. After all, such decisions cannot be made in an instant." She paused, then continued, "And have you told Arthur about your true feelings? About your fear of letting the children go?" Gray pondered. She hadn't really spoken to him about her deepest fears. She was afraid of his reaction, afraid he would again tell her to give up the children. "No, Mrs. Olga," she replied quietly. "It might be worth it, Gray," Mrs. Olga said. "Your husband needs to know what's going on in your heart. Maybe he can support and reassure you." Gray thanked Mrs. Olga for her advice. Her words made her think. She realized that hiding her fears from Arthur wasn't the best option. That evening, when the children were asleep, Gray decided to talk to Arthur openly. "Arthur," she began, sitting next to him on the couch, "I want to talk to you about something important." He put down the newspaper and looked at her. "Go ahead," he said. Gray told him about her fears, about how she was afraid of losing Sophia and Mark, about how attached they had already become to each other. Arthur listened in silence, attentively. When she finished, he took her hand in his. "Gray, I don't want them to go either," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "But we need to find their parents, that's the right thing to do." Gray felt tears welling up in her eyes. "But what if they don't want them?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Arthur looked her in the eyes, his gaze firm and reassuring. "Then we'll be their real parents, Gray. We'll do everything we can to make sure they grow up happy and loved." In his words, Gray felt not just support, but something more, agreement, affection. For the first time, she saw that he, in his own way, had become attached to the children too. The next day, Gray approached Maxim, who, as always, was helping her with the children. "Maxim," she said, "Arthur and I have decided that for now we won't send the children to a shelter or look for a new family. We'll raise them ourselves as our own." Maxim raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Are you sure about this? What if their parents are found?" "Then we'll deal with it when the time comes," Gray replied. "But right now we want to give the children stability and love. They need that." Maxim was silent for a moment, then smiled. "I'm very happy for you, Gray," he said sincerely. "And I'll always be here to help in any way I can." So the decision was made. Gray, Arthur, and Maxim came together, forming their own kind of a family where each played an important role in Sophia and Mark's lives. Life became even more chaotic and exhausting, but now it was filled with children's laughter, toothless smiles, and boundless love. Gray finally felt like a mother, not perfect, but real, caring, loving, and protecting her children. Days turned into weeks, months. The children grew, developed, and with each passing day, it became increasingly clear that they had become an integral part of their lives. Arthur spent more and more time with the children, helping Gray with their care and even taking the initiative to play with them. One evening, as Gray rocked the sleeping Mark in her arms, Arthur gently kissed her forehead. "Thank you, Gray," he whispered softly. "For everything." Gray looked at him, her heart overflowing with emotions. She realized that their situation wasn't entirely ordinary, but despite all the difficulties, they had created something special together, something that brought them joy, responsibility, and a new meaning to life. And although the search for Sophia and Mark's parents continued, Gray was no longer afraid of the future. She knew that whatever happened, she and her newly formed family would be together. They would fight for their happiness, for the right to love and be loved. And that ultimately was the most important thing. 6 months had passed since Gray, Arthur, and Maxim took responsibility for Sophia and Mark. The children grew, delighting them with their first steps, babbling, and toothless smiles. Gray blossomed completely in her role as a mother. She took care of the children, sang them songs, told them bedtime stories, and cherished every moment spent with them. Arthur also fully immersed himself in fatherhood. Initially somewhat reserved and unsure, he gradually found his way with the children. He played with them, read them books, and in the evenings, when Gray was tired, he could put them to bed himself. Maxim, as promised, was always there. He came several times a week, helping with walks, baths, and sometimes even stayed overnight, allowing Gray and Arthur to rest a little. One sunny day, while playing with the children in the park, Gray met her acquaintance from the women's consultation, Alina Petrovna. They chatted warmly and Gray proudly showed her little darlings. Alina Petrovna was touched, playing with Sophia and Mark. Then, after a short pause, she hesitantly said, "Gray, you know, I've been thinking. Maybe I can help you." Gray looked at her in surprise. "How can you help?" she asked. Alina Petrovna explained that she was working with a young girl who had given birth to twins but had decided to give them up due to difficult life circumstances. "She's very young, Gray," Alina Petrovna continued. "And she's struggling a lot. But she's constantly crying and saying she's made a big mistake." Sharp pain ripped through Gray's heart. She understood what this girl might be going through. "And what are you proposing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I thought that maybe you would like to talk to her," suggested Alina Petrovna. "Perhaps you can understand her like no one else." Gray pondered. The idea of meeting Sophia and Mark's biological mother troubled her, but at the same time it sparked hope. Although Gray had long considered herself the mother of these children, she understood that they had another mother, and she was curious to see her, to talk to her. Eventually she agreed to the meeting. Alina Petrovna promised to contact the girl and inform her of Gray's decision. For the next few days, Gray constantly thought about this upcoming meeting. Many questions troubled her. Who was this girl? Why did she give up the children? Would she want them back? She realized that this meeting could completely change their lives and prepared herself for any possible outcome. The days dragged on slowly, filled with anticipation and anxiety. Gray tried to focus on her usual tasks, but her thoughts constantly returned to the upcoming meeting. She shared her anxieties with Arthur, and despite his own fears, he assured her of his support. Finally, Alina Petrovna informed them that the girl, named Alina, had agreed to the meeting. They scheduled the meeting on neutral ground, at a cafe near the park where Gray often walked with the twins. On the day of the meeting, Gray nervously twisted a handkerchief in her hands, waiting for Alina. When the cafe doors opened, she lifted her head and saw a young girl who looked somewhat bewildered and scared. Gray stood up to greet her and introduced herself. Alina, with lowered eyes, responded. They sat down at a table, and after a long, awkward pause, Gray began the conversation. She told Alina about how she and Arthur found the twins, how they cared for them, and how much they loved them. She spoke calmly without judgment, trying to understand her motives. Alina listened, her eyes moistening with tears from time to time. When Gray finished, she told her story. She was a student, got pregnant accidentally, and the children's father refused to take responsibility. Out of fear of judgment and uncertainty about her abilities, she made the hardest decision in her life, to give up the children. But, according to her words, this decision brought her nothing but regret and pain. Gray sympathized with Alina. She understood that the girl found herself in a difficult situation and lacked support. They talked for a long time, and with each word some understanding, perhaps even sympathy, grew between them. Towards the end of the meeting, Alina asked Gray if she could see the children. After some hesitation, Gray agreed. She knew that Alina had the right to see her biological children. The three of them approached the park where the children were playing. Alina watched from a distance as Sophia and Mark, joyfully playing on the playground. When Gray picked them up and brought them to Alina, the children, with their typical trust, reached out to the stranger. Alina cried, embracing them and whispering apologies. It was a difficult but necessary meeting. It raised many questions but also opened up new ones. Alina promised to fight for the right to be part of her children's lives, and Gray could not deny her that right. The following days were filled with discussions and reflections. Gray, Arthur, and Maxim sat down together, trying to understand how to proceed. On one hand, they understood Alina and her desire to be with the children. On the other hand, they had long considered themselves as Sophia and Mark's parents and couldn't imagine their lives without them. The fate of this unusual family and the decisions they would make would only be revealed with time. But one thing was clear: their lives would never be the same as before. It became more complicated but also filled with new experiences, emotions, and undoubtedly love. Several weeks passed since the meeting with Alina. Her appearance disrupted the usual rhythm of Gray, Arthur, and Maxim's family life. Now they had to not only take care of the children but also navigate the complex question of how to build a relationship with their biological mother. Alina regularly visited to see the children. At first, Sophia and Mark were a bit wary of the stranger, but gradually they got used to her presence. Gray observed these meetings with mixed feelings. On one hand, she sympathized with Alina and understood her maternal instincts. On the other hand, her heart clenched when she saw the children reaching out to Alina, their eyes shining during their interactions. She understood that over time, the bond between Alina and the children would only strengthen. And this sparked fear in her of losing the special closeness they had already formed. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Gray, Arthur, and Maxim gathered around the table to discuss the situation. The atmosphere was tense as each of them understood the importance of the decision they had to make. "Gray, I understand your fears," Arthur began softly. "But we can't forbid Alina from seeing the children. She's their biological mother and they have the right to communicate with her." "I know," Gray replied sadly. "But I'm just afraid she'll want to take them away." Maxim, who had been silent until now, decided to express his opinion. "Gray, we will do everything we can to prevent that from happening," he reassured her. "We'll try to help Alina understand that she needs not only to meet with the children but also to actively participate in their upbringing." They discussed various options, weighing all the pros and cons. In the end, they decided to offer Alina to move in with them. They understood that it was a risky decision as they would all need to learn to live together and build new relationships. But they also understood that it would give Alina the opportunity to prove her seriousness and desire to be a mother. The next day, Gray called Alina and invited her for a meeting. When Alina arrived, Gray, Arthur, and Maxim told her about their decision. Alina was taken aback. She hadn't expected such an offer, but at the same time, she understood that it was a chance she couldn't afford to miss. With tears in her eyes, she agreed. Yes, their lives became even more chaotic and complicated. Now they needed to learn to live, communicate, and raise 5 children together. But over time, positive changes emerged. Alina truly took on her maternal duties. She helped Gray with child care, participated in their games, and sang lullabies to them. The children, of course, needed time to adapt to the new situation, but gradually grew accustomed to the 5 adults surrounding them with love and care. After a few months, when the situation had somewhat stabilized, Alina filed a lawsuit to establish guardianship over the children. The legal process was complex and lengthy. Gray, Arthur, and Maxim put forth their utmost efforts to prove their love, care, and responsibility towards the children. Finally, after several hearings, the court decided to leave the children under the guardianship of Gray, Arthur, and Maxim. The judge acknowledged that while Alina had the rights of a biological mother, it was Gray, Arthur, and Maxim who had created a stable and loving environment for the children to thrive in. This decision was a huge victory for them. They understood that there was still a lot of work ahead, as they needed to continue maintaining relationships with Alina and explaining to the children why their family looked different from most others. But they were determined to move forward together, overcoming all obstacles on their path. They had long become a true family despite the unconventional path of their creation. They had learned to love, trust, and support each other, and that was the most important thing. 5 years had passed since the court granted custody of Sophia and Mark to Gray, Arthur, and Maxim. The children had grown, attended daycare, and their lives were filled with childhood joys, playing with friends, celebrating birthdays, and outings in nature. Of course, it wasn't always as simple as in typical families. They had to explain to the children why they had 5 parents and answer their numerous questions. And although there were sometimes difficult moments, they dealt with them together. After the court's decision, Alina moved to another city but maintained contact with the children and occasionally visited them. They communicated, and the children grew to see her as a close person, but not as a mother. Gray, Arthur, and Maxim divided responsibilities. Gray was responsible for household organization, Arthur for providing for the family financially, and Maxim, who worked as a teacher, helped with the children's education and upbringing. They didn't always agree, and there were arguments sometimes, but they learned to find compromises and make important decisions together. Most importantly, they had created a real, loving family where everyone felt needed and protected. They had learned to love one another, respect each other, and provide support. One sunny day, sitting on a bench in the park, they watched Sophia and Mark playing on the playground. "Look how big they've grown," Gray smiled. "And how happy they are," added Arthur, taking her hand. Maxim, sitting next to them, nodded, proud as he watched the children. They knew there were many challenges ahead, but they were confident that together they would overcome any difficulties. Because their family, despite its non-traditional nature, had become a true source of love, happiness, and support for them. And that was the most important thing. Thank you for being with us today. I hope that this story has brought you emotions. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel, and click on the bell so you don't miss any of our new stories. Thank you for your support. You are the best.